Welcome to Access Your Leadership, where we share inspiring career stories and talk about ways you can level up your own leadership potential. I'm your host and coach, Akeem Mokhtar, and today I'm here with Belle Walker. Belle is the founder and CEO of Belleview Consulting, which helps startups take a proactive approach to their organizational structure and culture. Belle, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, we started our conversation prior to the podcast about marathon running and my wife having just completed the Boston Marathon, which was cool, and your generous support and your own background about doing, marathons and having participated in those in the past, even the Boston Marathon specifically, which is so cool. I would love to start off with a leadership win. So you've got so many other wins we've talked about in the past, but what's a leadership win that comes to mind, personal or professional, that you'd love to share today?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this for the last couple days, and the win I want to share is actually from one of my clients. I'm cheating a little bit. I have two clients that are actually going through the same experience right now, so I'm going to kind of combine these into one because both of the leaders are showing real strength in tackling these challenges. I right now I'm a solo firm, and so I do believe that leadership and management are independent, but I think the best examples of leadership I'm seeing are really from my clients rather than my own work right now.
Yeah.
And so I've two clients that are facing a really tough point in their leadership journeys where they're realizing that they have roles in their organization that don't match the organization's needs right now or in the near future. And so, uh, both cases, there's a budget constraint. There's a need to really step back and look towards the future. And there's optimism. And so I think that's what makes these decisions particularly challenging. It's one thing if you have budget constraints and there's no money and you're just limited on how are you going to move forward, right? That is a tough moment as a leader. I think it's even harder when you say, all right, things are tight now. There is light at the end of this tunnel. There is hope on the horizon. And yet, where we are is not exactly the trajectory we need to be following to get there. And
Mm.
so, both these leaders are looking at roles within their organization and seeing this particular way that we've positioned a function is not serving us right now. And they're making some really tough decisions around how they're going to best support and design their organizations to move forward. And I call it a leadership win because there's such a temptation in that scenario to just let be what is happening, to let the people that they care deeply about stay in these roles that are at odds with the directions of their organizations. um, it seems like a win for everybody if you do it that way. Look, I kept this role, I kept this person at
Mm.
my organization, and yet the employees are also suffering in these situations. They can feel that there is a mismatch between what's being asked of them and the direction the organization is going. So stepping into those difficult challenges, it's tough, it's hard, and it's going to be the right thing for everyone. And I'm so proud of them making those difficult decisions.
Yeah, that's a great one. I love that you highlighted that because the blend of optimism in there with the obvious challenge of having to make those kinds of choices as a leader is what the journey is kind of all about. And I think, I'm always the one who's a big proponent of, leadership doesn't have to be heavy, leadership doesn't have to be complicated, and yet there are complex, challenging situations that occur where you have to make these big decisions about how you want to show up. And I love the fact that, yeah, there's a choice there of, can we just maintain the status quo because, we're not sort of disrupting the apple cart, so to speak? Or do I really need to lean into this and see this as an opportunity to be the leader that my organization, that my team, that my business needs?
Yeah, I mean, then there's lots of parallels. I see this all the time across my clients. And in this case, one of the parallels is that these roles evolved out of a desire to support the individuals that are in them, right? This is a theme of the work I do, is looking proactively at the way that organizations are structured, the roles, the responsibilities, and then finding the people that you have, how do you blend the roles that your business needs with the strengths and the needs of your team members? And I love to believe that there's always a way to bring those pieces together. The reality is that there isn't always. There often, usually is, but every now and then you end up with this gap. And I think it's extra difficult when you have a leader that has such passion and compassion that they have tried, really gone out of their way to
Yeah.
shape and craft a role to support someone that they value in their organization, only to find that that bridge was too wide, that gap was too far to really bridge. And it's a beautiful, if difficult, decision to recognize that there's a different place we need to go and a different way we're going to make this work for everyone.
Yeah. Well, there's the leadership component to it, which is, sort of the traditional leadership behavior and actions taken that we often think of. And then there's the self-leadership piece that you're talking about, which is like, how's this making me feel? How am I going to handle this? How am I going to process this? Because I just published a podcast today, and it was all around this idea around caring for your employees and how that gets infused into a culture. And caring for your employees doesn't always mean finding a place for them, and caring for your employees doesn't always mean avoiding conversations that might be uncomfortable or disruptive. Caring for them actually means making sometimes those tough choices and saying this isn't a good fit, or this doesn't align with where the business is going, or let's find a new place for you to land, and it may not be here.
Right, but let's find a place for you to land. Let's get you the
Yeah,
referrals you need, the references you need. One of the conversations I have had is the temptation can be to employ them for as long as possible because you
sure.
want to give them that paycheck and that support and the need. And if you're employing them on a fixed timeline that you know is coming, you're not actually doing them a favor
Right.
in not giving them that runway to make their own future decisions, right?
Yeah.
That there needs to be a perspective that's a selfish view, right? To say, well, I will feel better because I know I kept them on as long as possible, and that may feel good for you, but it's not necessarily what's best for your person. That's not necessarily caring for them and their career trajectory and the runway they need.
Yeah. I feel like we could do a whole episode just about this topic because it's fascinating, and you're right. I mean, there's so much wrapped up in that when you start to think about, well, what does it say about me if I can't find a place for this person, if I can't accommodate them in some way. And I'm not going to get into the details, but I have a client where we're going through the same situation where, their circumstances are slightly different in terms of the where the business is going and the health of the business right now, but also moving these pieces around makes me think about that Jim Collins reference of like, do you have the right people on the bus idea? And this is a little bit like a step above that, which is like, you might have the right people on the bus, but how do those match up to the roles that your business requires at this point in time? And having that awareness, and then also that, strength and confidence and comfort to then step into that conversation it's a real leadership challenge for sure.
It's almost like you looked at my LinkedIn and saw the part about lots of people focus on putting the right butts in the right seats on the bus. I like to focus on building the bus,
Yeah.
and it. This is where we get into some of those contradictions. You have the right people. Do you have a seat
Yeah,
for them?
yeah, yeah. It's a great one, and it is a leadership win. Thank you for sharing that. So, as we think about your own story, your own journey, can you tell us a little bit about where you're from, what you've done throughout your career and your life that's led you to where you are now?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a windy path, which I think you may have some familiarity with as well. But I like to describe myself as an accidental engineer. I started out, at least in college, in mechanical engineering, which was a big rebellion for me because the last several generations of my family had all been in computer science and computer engineering. And so it genuinely did not occur to me that I could have studied something outside of engineering until I was out of school. So I was trying to go the aerospace, mechy route. And that was, I figured it out. I made it work. But my sort of more natural inclination was more on the people and the art side. So I
Hmm.
was stage managing 40 hours a week. I was still getting out and flying as often as I could, which is a side passion as well. And
Yeah.
all of those pieces came together after I graduated, when I ended up actually getting hired to do project management to build an aerial photography operation because I had an engineering degree and I had all that stage managing experience, which is effectively project management, getting all the right people, all the right pieces into where they needed to be on a very fixed timeline because you have the theater the days you have the theater
Yeah.
and then it's gone. And then also the aviation part helped quite a bit. And so that really cemented for me that you don't always know where you're going to be headed. But if you pursue things you're passionate about now, you're going to be well prepared to step into a role that aligns with those passions down the road in the future. So I went after I did that job for a few years, I felt like I had been kind of running into a wall, learning lessons that other people had learned over and over again. So I went back to school to see if I could, stand on the shoulder of giants, all that good stuff, and decided to do what I call my engineering MBA. So went to a systems architecting and engineering program and focused my research specifically on organizations as systems
Mm,
rather than the sort of typical software, mechanical, etc.
yeah.
And it works really well because basically engineering problem solving is really, 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 really understanding the problem, which organizations need, understanding your constraints, which every organization has, and
Right.
then really taking a deep look at your materials. What do you have available? Bringing all those pieces together. Didn't see anyone else talking about organizational design and development quite that same way. So I started my consulting company right out of grad school. Promptly got cold feet, which was a good idea because I needed a little more real world experience. So built teams at a bunch of different organizations for another almost decade. Then in 2019, really turned to this kind of consulting full time and have been working with organizations ever since to think more proactively about how they are structuring the roles, the responsibilities, the processes, the collaboration, all of that invisible infrastructure that allows the people to achieve the goals they have in mind.
I love that. And I just love the overlay of what you were doing early on in your academic career and your professional career, and then how you've now woven that into what you do for organizations. I want to go back to the passion piece because I think that's really important because we hear so much about passion and sort of follow your passion and the cliche like do what you're passionate about, but it's a lot of people roll their eyes when they hear that because they're thinking like, well, that's not enough for me to make a career, that's not enough for me to create a path for myself, and there's a lot of this like I need to know what this is all going to mean, how this is all going to shake out. But I like the fact that you weren't just saying it as in like, well, find your passion and then just like sit there with your passion and things will unfold. It was really about identifying your passion and then proceeding into your professional life, eyes wide open, and seeing where that passion then aligns with what opportunities present themselves. Can you talk a little bit more about how you're able to do that?
Yeah, I think it's, as you said, it's not just follow your passion and wait for the world to rain down opportunity
Yeah.
upon you. There's, I think, a slightly deeper breakdown of understanding that if you are following passion in conjunction with your work, that it's going to help build those opportunities in the future. So you don't necessarily need to be able to see a clear path, but really putting your time and energy into something that you do not enjoy is setting yourself up to continue doing something you do not enjoy. And I have, friends, colleagues, etc., who have pursued degrees in their side time, that have pursued, mentoring opportunities, volunteer opportunities that have actually proven very crucial in pivoting their day jobs, for lack of a better
Yeah.
description. And so it's more about looking at the bigger pieces and how they fit into a puzzle. If you think of your passion as being, this core driver that's going to lead you on a specific path, I think that's putting a lot of weight
Mm,
on this notion. If you think of your passions as parts of a puzzle that are building this bigger piece, you can't get the full picture without each piece of the puzzle, and the passion is part of that, but it's not the whole of it.
yeah. I really like the way you describe that because I think that's exactly right. The weight that you're describing is the pressure that people put on themselves to then nitpick every single interaction, every single opportunity, every transition in their lives to make sure that it's 100% touching the passion that I've identified, I have. It's like, well, yeah. And what if it's 99.9? Is that just like is that a failure in your eyes? And I think that's where people struggle with this, the ebb and flow of that. But to realize that the pieces that you were talking about, these are all part of the larger picture. When you can see that the pieces all come in and they're sort of touching on this passion that you've identified, and the passion fuels that, and it fuels your passion, and so on, then you realize like, oh, this is actually all creating a story. And I did a talk one time where I think that the name of the talk was ditch your pitch and embrace your career story. And the idea around that wasn't that, the elevator pitch or traditional elevator pitch as we always think of it isn't valuable. It is valuable. But do you understand your full story and how you've managed to pull in these different experiences and opportunities and relationships and learnings to then fuel whatever that passion is that you've identified, that then creates a story for you that you love? And then when you tell people that story, whether it's 30 minutes or 30 seconds, people feel that connection to your own story. So I love that there's that for you.
I think that's a big part of it. Also, there is something beautiful and deeply misleading about the past tense, right? Because when you tell that story retroactively, of course you can see how each little piece wove in.
Mm,
When you're looking towards the future, you mentioned running at the beginning. I love running. I haven't yet figured out if or how running fits into my career. And one day, if it does, it will all seem so obvious
yeah.
in a way that I can't possibly explain now. And it takes just as much time to say, oh, that was a miserable 5 minutes of my life, or that was an exciting 5 minutes of my life, as it does to say that was a miserable or exciting 5 years of
Mm,
my life, right? You don't know how long it's going to take to get there. And it's all going to wash out when you look back from the point of clarity.
yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's it's so important to mention the future piece. There's some readings that I've done in the past where I really like the idea around the power of presence. And we're sort of going on a little bit of a tangent here, but this power of presence is so important because it's all of that without factoring in the how or the when. And I kind of love that when I'm talking with clients. I said, let's just put how and when aside for a second. Let's talk about the what and the why. Like, what is it that you love to do? What is it that you're doing? What is it that you don't love to do? Why is it that you're doing what you're doing? Like, are you clear on that right now, today? And then the how and the when will sort of reveal itself as you continue to go through this journey. So as you've described your journey, can you talk a little bit about then you now 2019 you've come back to the idea of launching your own consulting firm. You've done that now. What's the unique approach that you've taken to working with clients that has you feeling so connected to the way that you approach, this subject?
I, I think it's very much that I pick up exactly where you left off. I love to focus on the how and the when, right? When I work with clients, I'm really looking for people that have a vision. They know where they're trying to go. They've got a team. They've got probably a great team. They have people that they want seats for on their bus, and they're somehow not able to connect those dots still. They're still feeling that gap, that pressure. And I can really dig in with them and say, how do we get from where we are to where you're trying to go? Can we write it in stone and have a path that you can follow exactly from point A to point B? No, that's not how the world works. What we can do is make sure that there is at least one path that gets from point A to point B, and that it's clear enough that as the world throws roadblocks in your way,
Mm,
you can figure out how to get back on that path or adapt it if point B shifts on you.
I love that. I like how complimentary that is because the people that I end up working with don't have that clarity, and that's why clarity is one of my first three C's. Is that clarity is so important, and once you create that clarity and then that confidence, and you're doing all this with the compassion, my three C's, is then work with someone like yourself to say, okay, I'm clear on all this now. I really want to start talking about like the nuts and bolts of this, like how and when can we make this possible? So I love that. What is it that you find when you're speaking with clients that um assuming that they've got that clarity, they've got that vision, they're really bought into it, they're deeply connected and aligned with it. Where do you feel like the struggle to cross over into what you do often occurs?
Yeah, there's a couple primary struggle points, I would say. The first is that this kind of future planning is rarely the biggest fire, right? My clients have a lot of things on their plate. They have a lot of jobs, they tend to be wearing a lot of hats, and many of those hats are very much about the present and the presence, dealing with today's crises. And it can be really challenging to carve out the time and the space to think about the future and actually chart out that path, especially when you know that path is going to change. It's one thing to sort of intellectually understand that everything will be easier and smoother if you have a vague plan for getting there than if you're just wandering around hoping to get there. And it's a very different thing to actually put the time in to thinking through the pieces, the implications, and laying all of that out. And so that's one thing where I think having an outside perspective can be really valuable, right? I say I, as an executive, could have used me as a consultant
Mm,
because it's not just about having the skills and the ability, it's about having the focus, the time, the perspective. So that's one major block. The other major block is often the folks that I'm working with are visionaries. They are people who love that strategic big picture. This is not where my passion is, right? I can start with a blank space and help people explore. It's just not what I enjoy
mm,
doing. I like when that goal is clear, and I work really well with people who want to say, "Oh, and what about this? Oh, and what about this? Oh, and what about this?" 90% of the time the answer is, "Yes, that's a lovely idea. Let's focus on where we're actually trying to go." But having that sort of give and take of, oh, that is actually a really important what about this that we need to make sure there's some flexibility for, and having that give and take I really enjoy. But you need both pieces, and oftentimes leaders, in those CEO owner roles are very focused on where to go and not as focused on how to get there.
mm, yeah. It makes me think of an old colleague I had who used to go around, and every time we would have these big team meetings, he would say, "Look, I'm just the vision guy. I'm just the ideas guy." And it was a little bit of a cop out, in some way, because all of us would be looking around the table and we were the ones who would have to execute on that. And we say, like, we love the ideas, but we've been here for an hour and we've come up with 40 ideas and we don't have any action steps to take next to actually put any of these in motion. And I think I saw that in my sort of middle management role at the time as a really frustrating dynamic for senior leadership and then those I was managing to reconcile, because it was, yeah, but we just want to get things done. We just want to do productive, meaningful work. And yet you're coming out of these meetings high off of all the ideas that have been generated, and we're all feeling overwhelmed that we don't even know where we go once this, meeting has adjourned.
Exactly. And so having an extra voice that can help sort of focus and corral that conversation can be incredibly valuable. I think there's also a piece that folks don't often want to talk about for those creative visionaries, which is every single one I've worked with has had maybe a 5% hit rate at best,
Mm,
right? The people with the absolute most stellar ideas have a lot of ideas,
yeah.
and most of them are not those absolute most stellar ideas. And so having that filtering mechanism is incredibly important. And the I'm just an idea guy folks that I know who have been most successful recognize that the vast majority of their ideas are not worth pursuing, but they realize also that they have to keep throwing them out there to get to those real winners. And so they
Hmm.
appreciate the folks in their circle who can help them sort through and see,
Hmm.
oh yeah, yeah, that one is the one to go for. But it can be very difficult, especially in a power dynamic imbalance, to be able to call someone out and say, okay, that's your 50th idea. Two of those were fantastic. Can we just forget about the other 48, please?
Yeah. Yeah. That takes, I mean, that's a lot of awareness, a lot of self-leadership for those leaders to recognize that and to stay in that conversation and not make that all about them when they're getting that feedback. I'd love to go back to the first obstacle that you were mentioning. So when you're talking about, and we hear this all the time, and I know that you do from your clients, I certainly do from mine, sort of being busy putting out fires all day, right? That's the piece of like what we're dealing with in the present moment and not actually carving out the time and space. And I love that you said space because I talk about this all the time where, where are we finding space in the day to actually have these types of conversations, to be challenging something that we think is an absolute or true to us, and realizing
Mhm.
that it may be, there's a bit of a story wrapped around it, or it's a lot of assumption or judgment. And then when we realize, oh, okay, that it's oftentimes because I haven't created that time and space to evaluate these things. How do you communicate that with your clients who haven't created that time and space, that doing so is valuable and is what's going to help them transition from the clarity of vision to now let's actually put some things in motion and execute?
This gets into why I'm a consultant and not a coach. I just say things.
Yeah.
So, how do I communicate that? I say it pretty much exactly this way. Most of the folks I'm working with, they do understand that they need to put the time, the energy, find the space for this kind of work. That's why they're talking to me in the first place. And they often have been trying and failing to build it for themselves. And so that's where that I, as an executive, could have used me as a consultant started coming from, was recognizing that one way to find and build that space is to ask someone to come and hold it for you, to use me as a source of accountability, as a forcing function, to provide, to come in and say, this is the time with Belle, this is the time where we're going to look at the future, where we're going to figure out what's next, not what's now. And that's I think something I just say point blank.
Yeah. So is the assumption there, Belle, then when people come to you and these leaders are working with you, that they are already, for lack of a better word, like primed to have those conversations?
I would say yes. Yeah, a lot of, well, coming back to the part where I want people to have that vision in place already. If someone
Sure.
comes to me and says, I want to 5x my revenue, and that is as far as their
Mm,
vision has gone, fabulous people like you that I can send
yeah.
them off to say, there's more to this vision that needs to exist.
Yeah.
uh, Before we start digging
Love that.
in. And so, in general, the folks that I'm working with have put some real time and effort into thinking about where they're trying to go, and they're still not sure quite how they get themselves and their organization to start walking that path or even defining that path.
Yeah, I like that distinction a lot. I mean, it's helpful for me even to hear that because it's just helping solidify for me my role in where I'm working with my clients, as I'm thinking about, sort of the primer, if you will, that I'm working with them to make sure that they're even receptive to those conversations. And then when they're part of those conversations, they can be had productively. Because
Right.
if it's you meet with these folks before they're ready to meet with you, then you're wasting everyone's time and money, when realistically they ought to be going through the process that I often take my clients through, to then say, great, we're clear on that. You got to go talk to Belle because Belle's now going to help you put things in place that are actually going to move the needle now towards the direction that we're very clear you want it to move towards.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the other big roadblock is the this is how it's always been done.
Sure.
Oh, we can't possibly do that. I
Yeah.
kind of like those.
Yeah.
I have found that if I make people explain to me in great detail why they can't do things, they usually talk themselves into it
Yeah.
because they run out. Well, one of two things happens. Either there are very real reasons why you can't do it, and I learned something, or there are not very real reasons, and in trying to explain it as simply and basically as possible, they end up realizing, hey, maybe that is the direction we should go.
Yeah, I often joke about my time when I was at Harvard Law School, where you can imagine at a place like Harvard, you get that's the way we've always done it refrain pretty regularly. And I felt like this kind of, sort of petulant child, or this toddler that was walking around just like asking, but why? Because I was genuinely curious, like, well, explain to me why that's the way we've always done it. Because you've tried the other 10 ways and this was the best way, or is it just because you don't have the resource? I mean, what is it? And just like you, I often either was educated about how this has evolved to be the way we now do it, or in a matter of minutes, you see the light bulb go off and they realize, well, I'm not sure why we haven't tried it that way, or, because this is the way I was told when I got here, and I just kept this, sort of maintain that status quo.
Yeah, it's the why do you do it that way today?
Hmm.
Right? There's one of my favorite stories is a client in their bookkeeping processes. They had this little subset of stages where they were taking some information in QuickBooks. They were printing it out on paper, scanning it, and then uploading it into QuickBooks. And when you just say it like that, it's like, what? How, what were they possibly thinking? And if you go way back, it actually makes perfect sense, right? This was information that used to live in two separate physical file folders, and one got digitized first, and then you still had to print it out. And then the other got digitized, but this was back when it was hard to get the programs to talk to each other. So actually printing it out and scanning it was the easiest way. And then QuickBooks bought a platform, and so it all ended up. And the process had evolved in a totally reasonable manner incrementally, but only
Hmm.
when someone from the outside came in and said, wait a second, tell me that again.
Yeah.
And they had to actually listen to themselves explain it instantly, right? That process never happened again after that conversation. It was a very, very quick fix, but they needed that pause and reflection to see that what served then was not serving now.
Yeah. And I can imagine the way that you're having these conversations, even when you say, I just tell them, it's coming from a place of non-judgment. It's coming from a place of not right or wrong necessarily, this sort of black or white, right or wrong, but of I'm just curious. Like, let's just start with that. And
Right.
I always tell my client the magic is in the conversation because as you sit and try to articulate the reasons why you do things a certain way or the rationale that you've adopted for making decisions about this or that or seeing opportunities, whatever it might be, you start to hear yourself. And then that opens up the conversation to say, I could see you sort of squirming at your own explanation around why you do this. Tell me more about that. And that I always find is a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, and I always try to position, especially when we're doing process work like that. I
Yeah.
have I have never had a process survive intact through an in-depth review,
Yeah.
right? Because there's always something, and I do this to myself, right? When I go
Yeah.
back and look at my own processes, there's always something like that where when you actually step, you're like, wait, do I really need this? No. And so I think it also helps to go in with that expectation that
Yeah.
there will be at least one thing. The question is how many things.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you, so thinking about your own process and how you reflect on these things, I want to go back to when you mentioned getting cold feet and deciding that you wanted to get some more real world experience. What was that decision like? What was that point in your life like? And what did you feel like you gained from making that choice?
Yeah, I think the decision came from cold feet is probably the best explanation for it. Also, I'm kind of a I'm not a stereotypical entrepreneur. There's a lot that's actually very mismatched for me as a CEO, right? I
Mm,
am naturally a COO. I am naturally more of an implementer. See the previous statements about I don't like thinking about where we're trying to go. That's
hmm.
not what you normally pick in your CEO. And so I felt some of that initial tension very early in terms of I don't have this big strategic vision and plan as a consultant. And so for my own personal development, I realized I needed to be in more executive leadership roles and learn what that experience was like and how I could do that for myself. Also, there just was something that felt disingenuous about telling leaders, hey, I think you should do this, but I've never actually done it. And
Yeah.
so going in, running organizations, actually applying these principles, building and structuring teams the way I thought they should be based on the academic side, I thought was really, really valuable and, ended up refining my approach. Not a ton, but enough in ways that I think made a really big difference.
Yeah, I like the fact that it sounds like it, the way you're describing it, that there was a lot less, you know, beating yourself up or, self-judgment and, look at my shortcomings and more of this is an opportunity. I could go this direction, but I'm feeling the incongruency and the misalignment a little bit with doing so now in this way. Or I could go in this direction, which feels better for me and ultimately would yield a, maybe a better result long term. And making that choice, did you find yourself struggling with that, or was it pretty clear once you had that sense of the two directions?
Well, I think you used a really important word there, which was now. Right, coming out of grad school, I was older than I was when I came out of undergrad, but I still knew I had a long career ahead of me. And
Hmm.
so I never particularly felt like I was picking one path at the expense of
Yeah.
the other.
Yeah.
I felt like I was picking one path for now, and I would see where that took me, right? Again, the story is very clear. In retrospect, I did this work in my undergrad, and it did eventually lead back into this full-time consulting. And if I had never decided to take this consulting sort of exit ramp from the traditional career ladder, then I could have said, well, I explored consulting for a little bit and it really jived for me to be in these larger organizations driving change from within, right? It's as much about the narrative that we create, forward and backward looking, as it is any particular moment.
Yeah. The thing I want to repeat for anyone who's listening, because I think it's really powerful, is it was not at the expense of. And that line I think is so important because this binary thinking that so many of us have, it's right or wrong, good or bad, this way or that way. And I live in this sort of world of both and very much. And when we're thinking about choice, I think a lot of people fall into that trap of, if I make this choice, it's going to negatively impact something, or it's in place of something else, versus it's simply just a choice, and it's going to lead you to wherever it's going to lead you next, and then you'll have another choice to make. And I love the for now idea around that, because that's where you were in that moment. And I think that a lot of people are trying to anticipate 10, 20 steps ahead, which, there's some value of being proactive, of course, but also it creates that unnecessary pressure to then say, well, how can I know for sure? I mean, you hear people talking about it all the time. If I just had a crystal ball, it's like, okay, well, when you find that crystal ball, let me know, because that doesn't exist. So where do you want to go now? What feels the most aligned for you now? And I think that's just a great example in your own journey where you've done that.
And how do you keep the paths open?
Hmm.
Right? It's one of the things that I feel very strongly about, and why I think it's so important to proactively look at your org design, the way you're breaking out your roles and responsibilities. I've seen way too many organizations that make a decision today that accidentally totally precludes being where they want to be, and they
Right.
have to completely reverse that decision. And so there may not be a straight line from point A to point B, but there can definitely be some giant freaking walls between point A and point B. And if we could just skip building those so we don't have to knock them down again, that would be nice.
Yeah. Yeah, and in the process, not closing off all the other doors, thinking
Right.
that because we haven't chosen that exit or that direction in this moment, that those are no longer available to us in any, other way, shape, or form down the road.
Yep. That if you do build a giant wall, you can knock it down again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, that's right. I love that these conversations just kind of highlight the limitless possibilities so that people don't feel like they're crammed into these very narrow options for what's possible, or what they can explore. And when everything's on the table, nothing's off the table kind of idea, it allows people to see those as opportunities, and then to say, what about this? You may decide that that ultimately isn't the thing you want to do, but knowing that it's a possibility then just keeps you up open to others that come along throughout the journey.
Exactly.
Well, I appreciate you sharing your own journey about this. I love hearing more about what you're doing with the clients. I'm excited to continue keeping up with you. As you think about your own journey, the conversations you're having with clients, the work that you're doing, what have you found to be maybe a reoccurring or quite popular or valuable skill or attribute that listeners ought to focus on if they want to become better leaders themselves?
I think it's really understanding where you are most comfortable, where you want to stretch, and being okay with the fact that those two zones do not encompass everything, right? That there are going to be skills and areas that you are not comfortable in now and just don't want to be comfortable in later. And how do you surround yourself with the people, the resources, that outside support you need to really lean in on where you are and want to be so that you can focus in those areas without it being, again, at the expense
Yeah.
of the broader organization that you're leading.
Yeah, it's a great one. I think that it's very complementary to my own philosophy of this outside in thinking versus inside out thinking. When you can create that clarity around things you want to do, things you don't want to do, things you do really well, things you don't do as well, then you're not having to compensate for them all the time, or worry about how you can project a certain image of what you think you ought to be or ought to do or ought to sound like. I mean, think about this from a leadership perspective, but from a business ownership perspective, or a business leader perspective, there's a lot of times where I think you're exactly right. People are making choices and choosing directions of conversations or of businesses based on what they think it ought to look like, or what they've been told it should look like, versus ultimately what's most aligned with what they want to do and what their business is capable of doing.
Exactly.
So Belle, can you share with us a little bit about where people can get in touch with you, where they can learn more about the work that you're doing and the clients that you work with?
Absolutely. My website's probably the most comprehensive resource. It's belleviewconsulting.com. It's Belle, my name, View, because it is my view of the world, belleviewconsulting.com. Or you can find me on LinkedIn, Belle K. Walker.
Love that. And I'll include all that in the show notes so that people can reference those. Belle, thank you so much for taking the time today. It was a pleasure having a conversation with you and seeing you again and learning more about, kind of the inner workings of what you do and why you do what you do the way you do. Because I think your story kind of highlights that. And I think it's extremely valuable out there in the world. And also, as we discovered, quite complementary to how I work with my clients too.
Yeah, thank you. It's been such a joy to learn more about you as well.
Thank you. As always, I'd love to hear from you about the episode. What came up for you as you think about leveling up your own leadership game? And please, if you enjoyed the episode, I encourage you to like and subscribe. And if you want to connect with me, you can find me on LinkedIn at Hakeem A. Lockdar or at lockdarcoaching.com. Thanks for tuning in. Keep being great, and we'll see you next time.